play,
Yeah.
because it represents something that Oscar described very well, and I think everybody.
At the age of 62, Victoria Brynner, the only daughter of legendary screen icon YUL Brynner, has finally broken her decades-long silence. The man who captivated the world with his iconic bald head, piercing gaze, and unforgettable roles carried countless secrets behind the glimmering spotlight. Rumors about his private life, fleeting romances, and the truths hidden behind the stage lights surrounded him for years. Now, Victoria, after a lifetime of quiet reflection, has decided to reveal the untold stories, truths no one has ever heard about the father the world revered, but whom she experienced from a very different perspective. What prompted her to choose this moment to speak out? And what are the secrets behind the towering figure of YUL Brynner? YUL Brynner was born in Vladivostok, a remote city on Russia's eastern edge, in 1920. His father, a mining engineer, abandoned the family when Yul was still a child, leaving his Swiss-German mother to raise him in difficult circumstances. Stripped of stability, the young boy's life quickly transformed into a restless journey across borders. Together with his mother, he relocated to Paris, where survival meant improvisation. They endured poverty, and Brynner, far from the aristocratic roles he would later embody, worked odd jobs and drifted between worlds that seemed to offer little certainty. In Paris, music became both a refuge and a livelihood. Brynner mastered the guitar, his fingers dancing over strings in dimly lit bars, where smoke curled toward ceilings and patrons listened with half attention. He was not yet a star, but the seeds of performance were already being sown. From the bohemian music scene, he moved to the circus, embracing the raw physicality and daring that would later inform his stage presence. Eventually, the theater called, a new world where his intensity and exotic features could not be ignored. By 1941, as Europe was engulfed in the flames of war, Brynner crossed the Atlantic and set foot in America. But success did not arrive with open arms. For years, he scraped by, taking small roles and struggling to be noticed in an industry that often dismissed him as too foreign, too unusual, too difficult to categorize. Hollywood at the time thrived on predictability. Brynner was the opposite, enigmatic, hard-edged, and unmistakably unique. The turning point came in 1951 on the Broadway stage when he was cast as King Mongkut of Siam in Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I. It was a role that demanded authority, magnetism, and a presence that could dominate both stage and audience. And Brynner delivered it with such ferocity that it became inseparable from his identity. Over the course of his life, he would perform the role more than 4,600 times, crafting an interpretation so definitive that it earned him an Academy Award in 1956 for the film adaptation. For Brynner, the king was not just a character but a mirror, imperious, commanding, and enigmatic. That Oscar win catapulted him into Hollywood's upper echelon, and soon Brynner was not only a king but a pharaoh, a gunslinger, and even a robot. In Cecil B. DeMille's biblical epic, The Ten Commandments, he towered as the proud Pharaoh Ramesses, locking horns with Charlton Heston's Moses. In John Sturgis's Western classic, The Magnificent Seven, he played the stoic gunslinger, his bald head gleaming under the desert sun, holding his own alongside a cast of rising stars. And in 1973's Westworld, decades before artificial intelligence became a cinematic obsession, Brynner embodied the chilling menace of a robotic cowboy, his mechanical stillness and cold-blooded precision leaving audiences unsettled. What made Brynner unforgettable was not merely his appearance, though the shaven head became his cinematic crown. It was his ability to radiate a sense of absolute control, a kind of theatrical sovereignty that few actors could sustain. On screen, he seemed larger than life, a man who carried with him the weight of centuries, even when playing roles far removed from royalty. He was not versatile in the conventional sense. His performances rarely softened into vulnerability. But what he offered was something rarer: total conviction. Off-screen, however, Brynner's imperiousness was not just an act. He was notorious for his difficult temperament, his arrogance, and his uncompromising standards. Colleagues often spoke of him as both magnetic and maddening. On the set of The Magnificent Seven, His clashes with Steve McQueen became legendary. McQueen, hungry for attention, would fidget, gesture, or even adjust his hat in ways designed to steal focus from Brynner. Brynner, furious at the audacity, demanded that production crews rein McQueen in. The tension became so pronounced that it added an unspoken electricity to their on-screen chemistry. Even with luminaries such as Ingrid Bergman, Brynner's domineering personality could create friction. He demanded control in almost every arena of his life, from the framing of a camera shot to the arrangement of a scene. Friends and adversaries alike described him as a man who had to win, who had to dominate. This relentless assertiveness was both his weapon and his curse. It built his myth, but often cost him goodwill. Yet perhaps that was the price of being YUL BRYNNER. He was not designed to blend in, nor to be easily liked. He was designed to stand apart, to be remembered. And remembered he is. In an era crowded with stars, Brynner's silhouette remains distinct, his bald head and regal bearing etched into the cultural memory of the 20th century. He was a man who transformed personal struggle into an aura of power, who carved his name into Hollywood's pantheon by refusing to be ordinary. If YUL BRYNNER's career glittered with cinematic triumphs and commanding roles, his personal life was an entirely different drama, one that unfolded with as much intensity, secrecy, and contradiction as any film he ever starred in. Where the stage and screen allowed him to project power with absolute clarity, his private existence was a maze of passions, insecurities, and mysteries that left even those closest to him bewildered. Brynner married 4 times, and each marriage seemed to reveal a different facet of his enigmatic personality. His first marriage, to actress Virginia Gilmore in the 1940s, gave him his son, YUL Rock Brynner II, but it also exposed his restless spirit. Hollywood's newest rising star was not built for domestic routine, and before long, his infidelities and obsessions with his career created fissures too deep to mend. His later marriages, to Doris Kleiner, Jacqueline Thion de la Chaume, and ultimately ballerina Kathy Lee, were equally stormy, punctuated by separations, reconciliations, and final breaks. Brynner's charm could seduce, but it could not sustain stability. Beyond marriage, he moved through a constellation of high-profile romances with women whose names alone could command headlines. Marlene Dietrich, with her magnetic allure and sharp wit, was said to have been captivated by Brynner's raw masculinity. Judy Garland, fragile yet luminous, allegedly found in him both a protector and a tormentor, though their dalliance was brief. There were whispers of fleeting affairs with stars like Joan Crawford and Ava Gardner, though some accounts blur the line between fact and rumor. Brynner himself never denied these entanglements outright, preferring to let mystery feed his legend. And then there were the rumors that unsettled the public's image of him. For years, speculation swirled about Brynner's relationships with men, whispers that newspapers half reported, and gossip columns eagerly embellished. It wasn't until decades later, through his daughter Victoria, that acknowledgement came. Brynner had indeed explored relationships with both men and women. In an era when such revelations could have destroyed careers, his ability to keep this part of himself shrouded in secrecy spoke to his mastery of image control. He presented himself to the world as he wished to be seen, imperious, commanding, untouchable, even as his private life told a more complex story. Friends and collaborators described him as a man of extremes, at once domineering and magnetic, cruelly dismissive one moment, generously affectionate the next. He could cut a colleague to pieces with a single glance or disarm a room with laughter. On set, he demanded control not only over his own performance, but over lighting, framing, and even costume design. Off-set, he oscillated between volcanic temper and disarming charm. Women adored him, men respected and feared him, and almost everyone who encountered him came away convinced they had met someone extraordinary, even if they weren't quite sure whether they liked him. But Brynner was not only an actor of roles, he was a restless seeker. Away from Hollywood's cameras, he found other ways to channel his intensity. Few know that Brynner was also a gifted photographer. He carried his camera everywhere, documenting not only the glamorous circles he moved in, but also the quiet, overlooked details of daily life. His archive eventually grew to more than 8,000 photographs, an astonishing visual diary of mid-20th century culture. Among his subjects were some of the most iconic figures of the era: Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, and even Pablo Picasso. His photographs revealed an eye attuned not to grandeur, but to intimacy, capturing fleeting expressions and quiet moments that escaped the spotlight. His curiosity extended further still. In the 1970s, Brynner published a cookbook, blending his love of food with the eclectic influences of his multicultural background. Friends recalled evenings at his home where he would prepare elaborate meals, pairing them with philosophical discussions about art, history, and the meaning of power. He immersed himself in philosophy, particularly Eastern traditions, searching for answers to questions his fame and fortune could never satisfy. He was also committed to humanitarian causes, particularly through his work with the United Nations, where he used his star power to raise awareness about refugee crises and global poverty. And yet, even in these pursuits, Brynner was not easily categorized. Was he a humanitarian motivated by genuine compassion, or by the same thirst for control that defined his career? Was his photography an act of observation, or a means of shaping the world into frames he could dominate? The truth, as always with Brynner, lay somewhere in between. He was a man whose contradictions were inseparable from his genius, whose appetite for life seemed insatiable, and whose flaws only deepened his mystique. If YUL Brynner's private life was a labyrinth of passion and contradiction, his final chapter was the stark reminder that even legends cannot escape mortality. For all his imperious charisma, for all the roles in which he seemed untouchable, Brynner was undone not by rivals, scandal, or fading fame, but by a silent killer he had carried with him since youth: cigarettes. From his teenage years in Paris, Brynner had been inseparable from tobacco. A cigarette was always in hand, as much a part of his persona as his shaved head or steel gaze. Colleagues joked that the haze of smoke around him was like a stage curtain, rising and falling with his moods. But what once seemed glamorous, an accessory to the enigmatic star, would, decades later, exact a devastating price. By the early 1980s, Brynner's health had begun to betray him. The man who once strode across Broadway stages and Hollywood backlots with unshakable confidence now coughed through rehearsals. His once powerful frame diminished, his breath shortened. He kept his illness hidden for as long as possible. To the public, he remained the same commanding figure, reprising The King and I in tours that packed theaters worldwide. Audiences who had seen him decades earlier marveled at how little his energy seemed to fade. Yet backstage, he was fighting a battle few could imagine. Doctors had diagnosed him with lung cancer, and the prognosis was grim. Brynner, ever the proud and secretive man, refused pity. He demanded that those around him maintain normalcy, as though sheer force of will could hold death at bay. In private moments, however, he confronted the reality with an almost philosophical acceptance. Friends recalled him quoting Buddhist teachings about impermanence, telling them that life was only a role, and one day even kings must exit the stage. Still, he was not immune to regret. He confessed with rare vulnerability that if he could undo one choice, it would be the cigarettes. They had given him an aura of cool in smoky Paris cafes and Hollywood sets, but in the end, they robbed him of time. By 1985, the illness had advanced beyond treatment. Brynner, at 65, prepared for the final curtain call of his life. Yet even in decline, he sought to turn personal tragedy into something larger than himself. Shortly before his death, he filmed a haunting anti-smoking message, intended to air after he was gone. Staring into the camera, his once bold voice weakened but still unmistakable, he delivered a plea that would outlive him. Don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. It was not just advice. It was a warning etched in pain, the distilled truth of a man who had nothing left to lose but hoped others could still be saved. When Brynner died on October 10, 1985, in New York City, the news reverberated across the world. The bald king, the pharaoh, the gunslinger, the robotic cowboy. Gone. Tributes poured in from fellow actors, directors, and fans who had grown up watching him dominate the screen. Newspapers printed his image on their front pages, often paired with that now iconic farewell message against smoking. It was as if his death itself had been staged as one last act. The king, leaving behind both a legacy of cinematic power and a cautionary tale about the fragility of flesh. His funeral, held in France, reflected the contradictions of his life. Friends remembered him as both a tyrant and a genius, a man who craved control yet sought spiritual transcendence. Rumors circulated about who might attend: former lovers, estranged colleagues, children from different marriages, and whether rivalries might resurface even in mourning. Some say Marlene Dietrich sent a single white rose. Others claim Steve McQueen's widow quietly paid her respects, a symbolic gesture bridging the feud that had once defined two of Hollywood's strongest personalities. Whether true or not, these stories added to the aura of his departure. YUL Brynner's life, even in death, remained half truth, half myth. In the years that followed, his anti-smoking message took on a life of its own. Health organizations replayed his commercial worldwide, and countless viewers, struck by the sight of a once mighty star diminished by disease, quit smoking because of him. In a way, Brynner achieved something rare. His legacy was not only artistic but moral. His death transformed into a warning that saved lives. If his performances cemented him as a legend, his final words made him human in a way his imperious characters never could. For decades after YUL Brynner's passing, his legacy remained shrouded in equal parts admiration and myth. The bald monarch of Hollywood was remembered primarily through his unforgettable roles, his imperious voice, and that final, haunting plea against smoking. His personal life, however, lingered in shadows, whispered about in biographies, speculated upon in tabloids, but never fully confirmed. And then, more than 3 decades later, his daughter Victoria Brynner, now 62 years old, chose to break her silence. Victoria, who had inherited not only her father's sharp features, but also his unyielding sense of independence, spoke candidly in a recent interview that startled both cinephiles and historians. Her revelations peeled back the carefully crafted layers of myth that YUL himself had built during his lifetime. "My father lived as if he were always performing," she said. "The image people saw on stage or screen was not an invention. It was him. Proud, arrogant, magnetic, and often impossible to live with." For the first time, she addressed the tangled threads of his love life without hesitation. "Yes," she confirmed. He had romanced some of the greatest screen sirens of his age, Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, and Joan Crawford among them. These women, icons in their own right, were drawn to Brynner's mixture of authority and danger, but most of these affairs burned out as quickly as they began. "He loved the chase more than the relationship," Victoria noted with a wry smile. Yet she went further, acknowledging what had long been whispered, that her father's desires extended beyond women. According to her, YUL Brynner shared a deep, if complicated, relationship with actor Hurd Hatfield, remembered for his haunting portrayal of the picture of Dorian Gray. The two men, Victoria revealed, were bound by both admiration and rivalry. Companions in art, yet occasionally adversaries in love. Even more tantalizing were the rumors of an intimate connection with French poet and filmmaker Jean Cocteau. While Victoria stopped short of confirming every detail, she admitted that her father's bisexuality was not a secret within the family, only to the public. In her words, he was too big, too wild for one definition. Perhaps even more shocking was Victoria's dismantling of the myths YUL himself had spread about his origins. For years, the actor encouraged tales that he was part Romani, that he had fought in the Spanish Civil War, that his life before Hollywood was as exotic as the characters he portrayed. "He invented legends because legends suited him," Victoria explained. "He wanted the world to see him as larger than life, even off-screen." The truth, she insisted, was both less glamorous and more compelling. Her father was of Russian and Mongolian descent, a child uprooted by his father's abandonment, forced into poverty in Paris, and later driven by desperation to reinvent himself in America. "He didn't need the myths," Victoria said. "The real story was dramatic enough. She also spoke of his darker side, the tyrannical temper that could erupt without warning, the obsession with control that made him both brilliant and unbearable. He could silence a room with a look, she recalled. As a child, I often felt like I was living with a king, not a father. He demanded loyalty, attention, and obedience. But when he loved fiercely. He could be tender, playful, and even childlike when the world wasn't watching. Victoria's testimony painted a portrait of YUL BRYNNER that was both grand and painfully human. She remembered moments of warmth. Her father teaching her how to hold a camera, evenings when he cooked elaborate meals while quoting philosophers, or the way he laughed uncontrollably at absurd jokes. But she also remembered the loneliness of living in his shadow, the way his magnetism left little space for anyone else in the room. "My father was never ordinary," she said. "He didn't know how to be. He lived as if he were always under the spotlight, even at home." Her decision to speak out, she explained, came from a desire to reclaim her father from the mythology he had woven around himself. "I want people to see him not only as the king of Siam, or the pharaoh, or the gunslinger, but as a man. Brilliant, flawed, contradictory. Someone who carried pain from his childhood, who reinvented himself because he had to, and who never stopped searching for power, love, and meaning." Imagining YUL through Victoria's eyes, one begins to see him less as an untouchable star and more as a restless wanderer, a man who lived multiple lives within one. Perhaps in the quiet corners of his Paris apartment or the solitude of his New York study, he was haunted by the very myths he created, unsure where the performance ended and the real YUL began. Perhaps he built legends not only for the world, but for himself, to escape the scars of abandonment, poverty, and doubt. Victoria's revelations did not diminish her father's grandeur. If anything, they enhanced it. For in exposing his contradictions, his arrogance and tenderness, his lies and truths, his triumphs and regrets, she gave us a YUL BRYNNER who feels more alive than ever. Not a flawless monument of Hollywood, but a human being who lived fiercely, dangerously, and unapologetically. And so, nearly 40 years after his death, YUL BRYNNER continues to fascinate. Thanks to Victoria's courage, we are reminded that behind every legend lies a man. Messy, complicated, impossible to pin down. A man who, even now, refuses to be ordinary. More than 3 decades have passed since YUL BRYNNER passed away, but his aura is still there. And thanks to Victoria's sharing, people understand that. Behind every monument, there is always a real person, full of wounds, desires, passions, and mistakes. If you want to learn more about the lives of Hollywood legends, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.